Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this video we'll be talking about how to navigate using non-directional beacons or NDBs. This is an optional lesson that can be done as part of our VFR or private pilot training series, but is also valuable to instrument pilots. An NDB or non-directional beacon is actually a very simple nav aid and can give you a lot of information about your position with a quick glance. They came into use in the 1930s, replacing the more complicated and expensive four-course low-frequency ranges that came before them. Since they were less expensive to install, they only required a source of power, a transmitter, and an antenna. They allowed smaller airports the ability to install a simple navigation aid and even have an instrument approach. Since they're older systems that are more prone to errors, interference, and malfunction, they began to be phased out when GPS became widely available in the early 2000s. Today, only a small fraction of the stations that once operated are still online. This means it's becoming increasingly difficult to find an NDB to practice navigating with, so that's probably half the challenge of learning NDB navigation. But there are still quite a few in flight sim that you can use, and we'll talk about where to find them. There are still even some low-frequency NDB airways in the world, so we'll talk about how to find and navigate on those as well. Learning to navigate using NDBs will give you good situational awareness and will also teach you how to use bearing pointers for both NDBs and VORs on electronic flight instrument systems, as most are equipped with these. NDBs transmit on the low frequency range, typically between 190 and 530 kilohertz, just below the AM commercial radio broadcast frequencies, although they can be found on frequencies as high as 1750 kilohertz, although I haven't found any in Flight Simulator that are up that high. The signals they transmit follow the Earth's curvature, so they have a range in the real world of about 100 nautical miles over land and even more over water. But in flight sim, they seem to be limited to about 70 to 80 nautical miles, and that seems to be regardless of terrain or even aircraft altitude to a certain extent. In order to receive and navigate using an NDB, your aircraft needs to have an automatic direction finder or ADF. So an ADF is the receiver that you have on your aircraft, whereas an NDB is the station that's on the ground that you receive. Not all of the aircraft in Flight Sim have ADF receivers. There's one on both versions of the 152, both the regular 152 and the Aerobat. And then there's one on the 172 Classic that comes with the Deluxe Edition. In addition, any aircraft that's equipped with a Garmin G1000, G3000, or G5000 panel will have an ADF receiver, and most of the jets in the game also have an ADF receiver as part of their avionics package. There are also many third-party aircraft that have ADF receivers on board, particularly if it is a rendition of an aircraft that's manufactured prior to the 2000s, like older Cessnas, Pipers, Beechcrafts, and Moonies. Aircraft with Garmin 3X or Garmin Era 796 avionics do not have an ADF receiver. So the ADF on the Cessna 152 is located just to the right and down from the tachometer and just below the amp-meter on the right-hand side of the panel here. Our ADF receiver is this black box right here, and then the ADF display is this instrument right up here. On the far left of the unit, we have a power and volume control. The volume control doesn't seem to do much in Flight Simulator, but if you turn it all the way to the left, it will power the unit down. And then you'll notice that we have right now 3 digits up here. There are actually 4 up here. And these 3 big knobs here control those digits. The leftmost one controls the left 2 digits. So basically you can think of it being able to dial from 1 all the way up to 17. You can see it keeps going past 10, 11, 12 up to 17. And so that controls that first digit. The middle one controls the middle digit, and then the last one controls the last digit. And then we have several modes over here for the receiver. None of these make a difference in Flight Simulator. It really doesn't matter which one you put it in. They're all going to operate the same. BFO stands for Beat Frequency Oscillator. And what this does is this knob controls how your antennas are configured. You have 2 ADF antennas on the airplane. One is called the Sense and one is called the Loop. I believe in the BFO, one of those is turned off. I believe this works well for receiving stations that are kind of distant from you. And then if you turn it to REC, this is the mode you want in real life if you are having difficulty distinguishing the audio, if you're having trouble picking up an identifier, then that's the mode that you want to use. It's also good for listening onto AM radio stations, which you can do with an ADF in the real world, but obviously not in flight sim. And then ADF is kind of the standard mode that you want to use most of the time. And then test is actually supposed to, when you put it in there, it's supposed to spin the needle around on the display up there, but that doesn't really work in flight simulators. So ADF mode is really kind of the correct mode, but again, it really doesn't matter. You can put them in any one of the 4 modes in flight sim, and it will work for you. Looking up here at the ADF display, in the center you have an airplane picture, just like you do kind of, well, I guess you don't have one of those in the VOR, but like on an HSI, you have that display there to represent your aircraft. Then the yellow needle is called a bearing pointer. Whenever you're not receiving a station, it will go to a 90-70 orientation like this, so it'll lay flat across there. And then we've got a compass rose here. This is called a compass card. And you can move that, and it will show you if you're using an ADF. It will, if you line it with your magnetic heading that you're flying, it will automatically show you your magnetic bearing to and from the station. And if you are just line it up with north, then it will show you your relative bearing to and from the station. We'll talk more about what those terms mean here in just a little bit. So we're on the field here at Russellville, Arkansas. The identifier here is Kilo Romeo Uniform Echo. We do have an NDB on this field, so let's go ahead and tune that up and we'll see how that works. So the frequency for that NDB is going to be 379, so I will dial that in there, and you can see once I do that, the needle pops over to the left here to show me that the station is located about 15 degrees or so left of my nose currently. One thing that you will notice about ADF displays, at least with the old-fashioned ones on the 172 and the 152, is that it does not have an on-off flag like a VOR does. So, it will go to that east-west orientation whenever you're not receiving it, but you don't know that the ADF isn't located to the east of you when it does that. So really the only way to know that you're receiving the station is to continuously listen to the Morse code identifier. You can do that by plugging that button there. And then we get the Morse code identifier. So that's what you're supposed to do whenever you're navigating with an NDB. If you don't want to do that in flight sim, I won't deduct any points, but that's technically the correct technique. So in the 172 Classic, which is only available in the Deluxe Edition, I believe, your ADF receiver is located to the right of the GPSs, and the ADF display is located to the right of the tachometer and just below your 2 nav radio displays. Nice digital ADF here, kind of like having a digital record player, but hey, whatever floats your boat. We have several buttons on this one, and then we have a display up here. The leftmost button is going to switch you between ADF mode and antenna mode, and you can see it displays what mode is active over here on the left-hand side, and then the BFO button will put you in the beat frequency oscillation mode. Again, not really something you have to worry about. All the modes work the same, but technically most of the time you're going to want to be in ADF mode in the real world. And then we have a flip-flop radio here that has an active frequency on the left and a standby frequency on the right. And this one uses the big knob to change the left 2 digits just like it did in the 152. And then the little knob can actually be pushed in and out. So right now it's out. There's in. When it's in, it controls the 10 digit there. And when it's out, it controls the single digits. And so that's how you change your frequency there. I'll go ahead and dial it down to 379, which is, again, let's see here, the ADF or the NDB in Russellville. And then to flop out the frequencies, we just hit the frequency button. That changes them out, and you can see we're picking it up now. The needle's shifted over to point to where the station is there. Also have a volume button that doesn't work, but if you turn it off, it'll turn the system off again. And then this actually incorporates a flight timer and a lapse timer. This tells you it's in the flight mode there. You just push this button to change mode. So we're in the flight timer mode right now. It tells you how long your sim session has been going on, basically. I think you can, no, you can't reset that. And then you have an elapsed timer. It says ET down here. You hit the button and it will start counting up. And it looks like they fixed it. It actually is timing correctly. It used to time 1 second for every 2 seconds when they first came out with the game. But that's working now. You hit set again, it will stop the time up, and you hit reset, it will go back to 0. And then to get back to your frequency, so where you can see your standby frequency again, just hit frequency, and that will bring that up again. And then the display works exactly the same as it did in the 152. You have the compass card, the bearing pointer, the airplane symbol, and then your little heading bug here. You can align that with your magnetic heading if you want to use that to figure out what your magnetic bearing is. So for the G1000 panels, the way you want to get your ADF to display, you actually have to do two things. First of all, hit the soft key that says PDF, and then that will take you to this menu here that has bearing 1 and bearing 2. And so you want to hit either the bearing 1 or bearing 2 soft keys, depending on which one you want to use. That will bring up your bearing pointers, and then you keep hitting it until you get to where it says ADF in the bottom. And right now it says no data because we're not receiving one. But you could also pop bearing pointer 2 up there if you wanted to use that as your pointer for the ADF. Then we'll hit back to get to the tuner. You can see in the main menu here, the soft key here is ADF DME, so we'll pop that up. It brings up the ADF tuning mode. So we have, again, an active frequency here and a standby frequency over here. The whole frequency is flashing in blue. To change that, I'll roll the little knob here, and that makes it so that I can tune these left 2 digits. So I will tune it down towards Russellville's frequency. We just have the single flashing box, so now I can use the big knob to transfer between digits. So I will go ahead and dial up Russellville 379. Let's see here. So that's now in our standby frequency, and then I want to hit enter, and it will say enter to transfer. So I want to hit enter again, and that will transfer the frequency. And there we go. Now the bearing pointer is popped up. You can see it's pointed over towards the Russellville ADF again, the Russellville NDB. So that's how we get that up on the G1000 panels. So another couple of things that are kind of cool about the EFIS setup. The first thing is that if I do not have an active NDB frequency in the active frequency spot there, we'll switch this out. Right now this is Coweta County. This is nothing. So we'll switch those out. You'll notice that the bearing pointer disappears. So if the bearing pointer is not there, that functions as kind of like the to from flag on a VOR not being there. It tells you that you're not receiving a station. So it's not as critical on an EFIS system to monitor the ADF on the audio panel because if the bearing pointer is not there, you know you're not getting a station. If it's there, you know you are receiving a station. You still need to listen in to make sure that you're getting the right one, but you know if it's there or not by whether the bearing pointer is there. The other thing that is kind of cool is you can use the VOR course indicator on the HSI as kind of a reference if you want to track bearings. And what you want to do here is down to the CDI button, just press that to change the source. Right now I have one on FMS. That's if I click it again, that's VOR1, and I like to use VOR2. And I don't have an active VOR. I'm not actually receiving a VOR now, so I can change the course and just use it as kind of a marker. So let's say I want to track the 270 degree bearing outbound from this particular station. All I need to do is twist this VOR marker over there so that the tail is on the 270, the head's on the 090, and then when the tail lines up with this, the tail of the bearing pointer lines up with the VOR indicator, I know I'm on course. So that's another thing that's kind of a cool little feature of the EFIS bearing pointers. So the symbol for an NDB on a sectional chart is a very small circle in the center of the symbol there with a larger, darker circle around the outside there, and then a bunch of little dots arranged in a circle around that symbol. So looking at a sectional chart, this is about 70, 80 miles south of the Atlanta area. This is I-75 right here. And we have several airports out here that have NDBs nearby them. So we have one that's to the north of Montezuma Airport. We have one that is to the northeast of Jimmy Carter Regional Airport. And then we have one that is to the almost due west of Cordell Airport. Just like VORs, there is a information box next to the NDB that gives you all the information that you need to navigate with it. So here's it's a red box, just like the red symbol. So that's where the NDB information is located. It tells us the name of the NDB is Montezuma NDB. The frequency that we dial into our ADF is 426, and the identifier is India Zulu Sierra, and then here's our Morse code identifier, and we can tune in to that just like we would tune in with a VOR to make sure that the station is working and that we've got the right station dialed in. Occasionally you'll see a NDB located at an airport, and in that case the NDB symbol will be basically placed under the airport symbol, so you won't see the dot and the circle, but you'll see all the little dots in the circle around, kind of surrounding the airport, and then your information box will be somewhere nearby. And then there are actually NDB stations, particularly up in Alaska, is where you'll find most of these that have distance measuring equipment, or DME. And with that, you'll have the normal NDB symbol, but then there'll be a blue box around it, just like you'd have a blue box on a VOR DME. And the way this works is you dial in 385 on this particular NDB, and that would give you information on your ADF to navigate with, but then you dial in 10835 into one of your VOR radios, assuming it's equipped with DME as well, and then that would give you distance measuring equipment information as well as it would give you the distance from the station. One kind of quirk about this, and I don't know if this is something that happens in real life or not, but in flight sim, the DME off of NDB DMEs will only give you information in whole miles, and normally DME gives you information in tenths of mile measurements. So instead of seeing 1.2, 1.5 miles, you'll just see 1, and then it'll flip over to 2 and then 3 miles. So it's a little less accurate in flight sim. ADFs and NDBs are very simple navigation systems. The NDB puts out a signal, and the ADF receiver just points to where that signal is coming from. That's all it does. But you can gain quite a bit more navigational information if you know how to use this data. The direction to or from the station is referred to as the bearing. The bearing to the station is what direction you would have to steer to get to the station. It's what the head of the bearing pointer is pointed to. The bearing from the station is where your aircraft is located in relation to the station and is what the tail of the needle indicates. When instructors taught about NDB navigation, they would talk about two types of bearings: relative bearing and magnetic bearing. Relative bearing is how many degrees left or right of the nose the station's located, although it's always expressed as how many degrees right of the nose it's located. And it's what you read off the old school ADFs in the Cessnas if you don't move the compass card. For example, in this picture, we've got our bearing pointer pointed to 030 degrees, so our relative bearing is expressed as a relative bearing to the station of 030 degrees and a relative bearing from the station of 210 degrees. In this picture, even though the needle is now pointed 30 degrees left, we don't say it's a relative bearing of 30 degrees left. We express it as a relative bearing to the station of 330 degrees and a relative bearing from the station of 150 degrees. Relative bearing to the station gives us some useful information. It tells us how many degrees we need to turn left or right to be navigating directly to the station. Relative bearing from the station doesn't give us that much useful information. We need magnetic bearing for that, so let's talk about magnetic bearing. Magnetic bearing to the station is the magnetic course you need to steer to get to the station. You can read this automatically off the bearing pointer on an EFIS system since it's displayed over the heading indicator, or HSI. This is what the head of the needle points to. Your magnetic bearing from the station is where your aircraft is located relative to the station. You can think of this like a VOR radial. This is what the tail of the bearing pointer indicates on electronic instruments. Let's take a look at some examples. So in this example, we're looking at the G1000 panel from the 172. We have the VOR2 course indicator up there, but we're not receiving a VOR right now, and there's not a way to turn off either having a VOR FMS/GPS course indicator up there, so we just have it not receiving a VOR. And then we have the bearing pointer set, so it is receiving the ADF right now. And we're on a heading of 360, and the bearing pointer is pointing directly north. So our bearing to the station is 360 degrees, and our bearing from the station is 180 degrees. So remember, the bearing to tells you how to get there. We need to go north to get to the station. And our bearing from, our magnetic bearing from, tells us where we are located. It's just like a VOR radial. If you're on the 180 radial on a VOR, you're south of the station. So we are south of the station, and to get to the station, we need to track northbound. So in this example, our aircraft is now heading on a heading of 270. But if we look at the magnetic bearing to the station, it's exactly the same. Our magnetic bearing to the station is still 360. Our magnetic bearing from the station is still 180. So again, we're on basically the 180 radial. We can think of it like that. And we would need to go north to get to the station, but we are currently heading westbound. So this is what our situation looks like right now. And in our final example here, we are still on a westbound heading, a magnetic heading of 270, and we have a magnetic bearing to the station of 090 and a magnetic bearing from the station of 270. So in order to get to the station, we would need to turn around and head east, due east, and currently we are located west. So this is what our current situation looks like on a map right there. You can also get your magnetic bearing from the old-fashioned instruments on the Cessnas, and you don't necessarily have to move the compass card to do it. You can do it mathematically, but there is a much easier and quicker method that we'll talk about here in just a second. But if you are a glutton for punishment or you just like to do math, then you can do it mathematically, and the way you want to do it is add your magnetic heading to your relative bearing, and then subtract 360 if the answer is bigger than 360. So looking at an example, let's assume that our magnetic heading is 270. We're headed westbound. Our relative bearing to the station is 180. And so we add 270 plus 180. That gets us 450. That's bigger than 360. So we subtract 360 and we get a magnetic bearing of 090 to the station, or a magnetic bearing from the station. This also works with bearings from. So our magnetic bearing from the station is going to be 270 degrees. So basically we are in the same position we were in our last example with the G1000. We are traveling westbound. The NDB is behind us, so we would have to turn around and head eastbound if we wanted to go back to the station. The much easier way to figure this out in flight is to mentally move your bearing pointer from the ADF display over to your heading indicator. Voila, instant magnetic bearing information. So in this case, once I know my needle's pointed 90 degrees to the side, 90 degrees to the side of my heading indicator is north. So the head is pointing to north, the tail is pointing to south. I need to go north to get to the station, and I'm currently located south of the station. When you do this, you're basically mentally creating an instrument called an RMI, or radio magnetic indicator, which is basically what you have when you pop up a bearing pointer on an electronic heading indicator, or HSI. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of how to do this. So in this example here, I'm currently heading westbound. I'm on a heading of 270, and my magnetic bearing, or excuse me, my relative bearing to the station is 180. So if I mentally pop that needle from this over here, I know that my magnetic bearing to the station is a 090. I would need to go east to get to the station, and my my magnetic bearing from the station is 270. I'm located west of the station. So I am tracking away from the station. The station is directly behind us. I am west of it, and in order to go to the station, I would need to turn around 180 degrees and go eastbound. Like a VOR, the simplest thing you can do with an NDB is navigate directly to it, and that is very simple. In a no-wind condition, you just turn so that the bearing pointer is at the top of the instrument, and it will take you to the station. If you have a crosswind, you'll need to apply some crosswind correction, so the needle will be slightly to the side if you need to do this. You basically want to find a heading that makes the needle not move, even if it's not directly at the top of the instrument. This is called tracking to the station. If you don't apply crosswind correction, you'll end up doing what's called homing to the station rather than tracking. With tracking, you fly a straight line to the station on a constant course. With homing, you'll be flying a slightly curved and longer course. The way this works is you center up the needle to fly directly to the station, but then the wind pushes you off course and the needle comes off center. You turn to center the needle up again, but you don't apply any crosswind correction, so you get pushed off course again. And then you basically repeat this process as you make your way to the station. This isn't a big deal if you're flying via VFR, you're still going to make it to the station, but you do want to be a little more precise if you're trying to track an airway or track a bearing for instrument flight. You can also intercept and track a specific bearing to or from a station. To do this, you need to remember a few simple rules for navigating with an ADF or any bearing pointer type system. The first rule is that the head of the bearing pointer will always point to the station and indicate your current bearing to the station. The tail of the bearing pointer will always give you your bearing from the station or where your aircraft is located relative to that station. And the final rule is that unless you're tracking directly to or from the station, the head of the bearing pointer will always fall to the bottom of the instrument and the tail will always rise. A lot of pilots like to remember this by saying the head is made out of lead and it's always going to fall. So let's look at how to intercept and track bearings with a couple of examples. Let's say we're flying on a west heading 270 when we dial in an NDB and we find out that we're located northwest of the station on the 330 magnetic bearing from the NDB. I want to track outbound on the 270 bearing from the station. I know that on this heading the tail will rise towards the bearing I want to intercept, but on this heading it won't rise very fast and it won't get all the way there because I'm basically paralleling that bearing. So I'll take a cut to the left and take up an intercept heading of about 240, and then wait for the tail of the bearing pointer to rise to the 270 bearing from the station. Once the needle rises into place, turn to a heading, in this case 270 degrees. If the needle strays from your desired bearing, make a turn to position the needle so that it will rise towards the bearing you're trying to track. Generally, when trying to track a bearing outbound, you want to turn away from the tail of the needle to make corrections. Just like a VOR, the bigger intercept angle I take, the faster the needle will move, and you need to be careful how large an intercept angle you take when you're close to the station, as the needles will move very fast when you're close. So let's take a look at another example. This time we'll intercept and track a bearing to a station. Let's assume that we're still heading westbound and that I want to track inbound on a 360 bearing to or 180 bearing from another NDB that's located to the northwest of me. When I tune up the station, I find out that I'm on the 150 magnetic bearing from the station, so I'm southeast of the NDB. If I continue to head west, the head of the needle will fall towards the 360 magnetic bearing 2, so I can just continue to hold my course and then turn north once the needle centers on the 360 magnetic bearing to the station. I might want to lead the turn by 5 degrees or so since I am on a 90-degree intercept, depending on how far away from the station I am and how fast the needle is moving. You could also make a turn to the northwest a little initially to make a shallower intercept if you wanted to do that. The same technique works if we're using an old-fashioned ADF system like on the Cessnas, except again, we have to mentally move that needle from the ADS display to the heading indicator to get our magnetic bearing, unless you want to continuously keep turning the card or doing math. And again, you can also use this technique and these skills that you're using with the ADF to intercept and track VOR radials on any EFIS system that can display a bearing pointer for VORs, which is most of them, and I think all of the ones in Flight Simulator have that ability. So where are some areas that we can find NDBs to practice with? Well, one area that I found in particular that has a lot of NDBs around the periphery is the Atlanta area. If you look north and then northeast and east and south and then a little bit to the west, there's quite a few around here. I'll zoom in just a little bit. We can see that there's one up here by Cherokee County. There's another one over here by Lee Gilmer. I think this is the Gainesville area. There's another one over here fairly close to Athens by Barrow County. Then there is another one down here at Covington. There's another one down here at that's Peachtree City, Falcon Field. There's another one here at Coweta County or Noonan. And then there's another one up at, there it is, Carrollton. So those are all fairly close by. And then if we head to the south, you can find a few more down here. There's one down here at Thomaston. Another one down here at Montezuma, and then there's kind of three real close together here, Montezuma, Americus, and Cordell. So all of these areas have NDBs. This is probably the area that I've seen the highest concentration of still active NDBs. Not that I've done an extensive search, but it's one of the highest areas that I've turned up. And another area of the country that has a lot of NDBs still is Alaska. This is Anchorage right over here in the bottom right corner. And then you see all these red lines that are going to and from places up here. Those all lead to NDBs. These are all low frequency airways. So you can see there's quite a few up in North Alaska. There's quite a few still in the Central Alaska area, and they extend all the way into the Aleutian Islands. So that's another place that you can go out and practice flying on NDBs if you'd like to do that. Plus, there's a lot of really cool terrain up there. Let me talk a little bit about these low frequency airways in Alaska since we're up here anyway. We'll talk about how to use those real quick. You can see these red lines that are going between NDBs are the low frequency airways in Alaska. That use NDB bearings to fly these airways. There is some talk of decommissioning these at some point in the future, but that hasn't happened yet, so they continue to be on the charts. You can see they're designated with R's or G's or B's, and I believe you can also have A's. These are actually called colored coded airways. The R stands for red, the G stands for green, the B stands for blue, and the A, if you can find one, stands for amber. So this is actually, if you file this, you would file red 39. And the way you track these is that you track the outbound bearing from the NDB that you're starting at, and then about halfway through the route, you switch over and track inbound to the next NDB. Of course, the problem is that it doesn't actually show the bearing that you're supposed to track. So if you want to see what that bearing is, you have to enter the two NDBs in Sky Vector on a flight plan, and then that will show you what your outbound is, and then you can do the reciprocal to get the inbound to the next NDB. And if you want to enter those two NDBs in there, you don't have to put a departure or a destination airport in there. You can just enter in the leg page the two navaids. So I put in OSE and ANI, and you can see it gave me a course there. It's the 042 bearing from, going outbound from Bethel, and then that would be the 222 bearing to Antioch when you want to switch over about halfway in between. Another thing I'll mention about these low frequency airways is that you'll notice that some of them are pretty long. This one's 198 miles long. In the real world, that probably works. The VORs, the NDBs probably work along that entire range. But in flight sim, since they only have a range of about 70 to 80 miles, you're going to get a portion of that route. We're going to lose signal coverage from both NDBs. You won't be able to pick either one of them up. So you just have to fly 70, 80 miles until you lose the first one, then hold your course until you can pick up the second one. So that's what you have to do in flight sim. Another good way to go searching for NDBs in Flight Sim is, ironically, to use the nearest function on the GPS to find them. So we're looking at the multifunction display on the Garmin G1000, and I will roll the big button to get over to the nearest page, and then I will roll the small button to get to the nearest NDB. And you can see it gives me a list of NDB, their direction from me right now, and their distance from me right now. And if I hit the middle of the button there, I can scroll down, and right now it's got the Tango Tango NDB highlighted, and it tells me the frequency is 338. So I can also get the frequency from there, and I can scroll down. So we got to use the big button for that. And so like Malvern, MVQ is about 42 nautical miles away, about a 283. I guess that's actually the direction 283 degree heading to get there, and the frequency is 215. So that's a good way to find NDBs as well. Also, you notice that some of these have two-letter identifiers. What these are is they're called compass locators, and they are associated with ILS systems. ILS systems can have them, but many don't anymore. But they're just a low-powered, kind of low-range NDB that they pair with the outer marker on an ILS system. So in the real world, they won't have as much signal strength, and so you won't be able to detect them as far away. I haven't really tested it out in flight sim to see if they're about the same as every other NDB, if their range is a little more limited like it is in the real world. So we'll do a little cross country here, a little demo cross country to practice navigating using NDBs. We'll start out at the Atlanta Speedway Airport, which is Kilo Hotel Mike Papa, a little ways south of the Atlanta area. We'll take off and head to the southwest. We'll dial in Coweta County VOR, which is 234. Shortly after we're airborne, we should pick that up, and we will track directly to that NDB. If we want, we can go ahead and make a landing at Coweta County Airport once we have uh, got that in sight. And then after we land there, or if you want to just keep going in the air, that's fine too. We'll intercept and track the 270 bearing outbound from the Coweta County NDB to practice intercepting and tracking a NDB bearing outbound. We'll track that for a little ways, and then we'll switch over to Carrollton NDB, and we will intercept and track the 360 bearing to the Carrollton NDB, and then we can move up and make a landing at West Georgia Regional Airport in Carrollton. And that'll give us practice tracking direct and then intercepting an outbound bearing and intercepting an inbound bearing. Okay, so set up for this flight, we will work left to right as we usually do at the top here. So the first thing we'll do is do the aircraft selection. And we're going to use for this demo the Textron Aviation Cessna 172 Skyhawk with the G1000 panel. We'll also do a couple of segments where we'll look at what it looks like on a fixed card, well, a movable card NDB, and we'll take a look at that in the regular 172 steam gauge, which is only available, I believe, in the deluxe edition. But that will show you kind of how things are going to look on a movable card NDB. As far as the weight and balance for this airplane, I go ahead and stick 2 full tanks of gas on there, and then I will also stick with the 2 170-pound occupants there, and that should be good there. If you want to add some more weight, that's fine, but it's not necessary. And then for our departure airport, it's going to be Kilo Hotel Mike Papa, and that is going to be Hampton Airport in Hampton, Georgia. And runway 24 is good for a departure runway, or you can start on the ramp if you'd like, but for the actual flight, 24 is the direction we want to be flying. As far as the flight conditions, again, I'm going to stick with the mid-June day, or the mid-June day at noon, which you need to adjust that down here for the lighting conditions, and then we'll set up the weather once we get into the simulator. And then that's all I'm going to do, but if you want to set up a route to have in your moving map and your VFR map, I'll show you a way to do that here real quick. So to set up this route to appear on your moving map, first of all, you want to make sure that if you go into filters, let's see, that is down here in more, and then open filters, and we want to go down to navigation, which is the bottom menu item there, and then make sure that navaids are on so we can see our NDBs. And then we will put in a destination airport, and the destination airport is going to be Kilo Charlie Tango Juliet, which is West Georgia Regional in Carrollton. So we will put that in there. And then after that, we will add in our navaids. And so I'm going to look down here by Noonan. Let's see here, there's the Noonan Airport, and here is the Noonan NDB. So I will click on that and then click add there. And then the other one we want to, the NDB identifier on that one is EQQ, Echo Quebec, Quebec. And then we'll look over here by Carrollton at the NDB that's just to the southeast of the field there. The identifier on that one is Golf Papa Quebec, and so we'll click on that and then click to add. And then for our tracking outbound on the Coweta County NDB and then tracking inbound on the Carrollton NDB, we're going to track outbound west, and we're then track inbound north on the Carrollton NDB. So right over here by Franklin, we can put in a user waypoint. So just a little bit to the left of where it says Franklin there. I'll left click on that, and then it'll bring up a custom waypoint, and I will click add, and it does a pretty good job. This can not be the most precise operation, but it looks like we did pretty good there. So it looks like it's due west of Coweta County. It is due south of Carrollton, more or less. And so that can kind of give you an idea on your moving map and on your VFR map of how well you're doing on staying on course using your NDB. I'm going to clear all that out. I'm just going to go straight raw data navigation. But if you want something to follow, that's how to set that up. Got a few last minute things to set up before we get in the air. And so we'll go ahead and click on fly and do that in the session. All right, so we're on the runway here in Hampton, and before we get started, we'll go ahead and tweak a couple of the environmental factors here. We'll start off with no wind, so I'll go ahead and go in here and delete that wind layer, and then I'm going to bump up the temperature so it's a little more realistic for a June day in Georgia. Up in the upper 70s there, should be about right. And then we'll do a couple of things to configure the Garmin G1000 here. So I will zoom in on the primary flight display here. First of all, we need to turn our bearing pointer on. So we'll go to, let's see here, if actually we're in the main menu here, you go to PFD, and then you go to bearing 1 and hit that. One time brings up nav 1, a second time brings up nav 2, a third time brings up GPS, and then the last time brings up ADF. So now our bearing pointer is active, and we'll hit back, and we actually need to dial in the frequency so that once we're airborne, we'll start to pick that up. So we hit the ADF DME from the main menu here, and then we can use the little knob to scroll down here. Frequency there is 234, so there's 2. We'll scroll over to the next digit, 3, and 4. And so now that is ready to go. I need to hit the enter key to flop that out. And there it is. It's all set up. Now I will go back to, I'm going to do just a couple personal preferences here to see the bearing pointers a little bit better. I'll go to inset. I'm going to turn that off. And then I'm going to go to PFD, synthetic vision. I'm going to turn the synthetic train off. Again, this is just personal preference for me. I like that to see the bearing pointers a little more clearly and not having the terrain stuff overlaid on that. But again, it's personal preference. If you would prefer to have the synthetic terrain up there, that's fine. You can also use the autopilot in this lesson too if you would prefer to do that to hand flying. I'm certainly going to do that. To fly this flight, perform a normal takeoff from runway 24 in Hampton. When you reach a safe altitude and you're receiving the Coweta County NDB, turn to navigate directly to the station. All right, so we're leveled off at 2,500 feet, and we've done our cruise checks, and we've got the Coweta County NDB tuned up. We have the bearing pointer displaying, and all we need to do is keep the head of that bearing pointer at the top of our HSI. In a no wind condition, navigation to an NDB is that simple. You just point the needle at the station and it will take you there. It's about 20 miles or so to between Hampton and Coweta County, so it should take us about 11 minutes at 116 knots of ground speed. So we should be here in the next 10 minutes or so, and then we can make an approach there at Coweta County. And to see what this looks like on an old-fashioned movable card ADF, it comes up as soon as we take off from Carrollton, and it shows a relative bearing about 10 degrees to the right or so. So we just turn to the right until that needle is centered up at the top of the gauge, and then we just maintain the heading to keep that needle at the top of the gauge. And so it's very straightforward, again, even with a old-fashioned movable card ADF. You just put the needle at the top of the gauge and that'll take you to the station. And just to show you what it looks like to track when you have a crosswind, I put in a wind here of about 340 at 20 knots, so it's coming out of the north-ish at 20 knots, pretty much a direct crosswind. And you notice I've turned right into the wind, so my needle is deflected left, but you'll notice that the needle isn't moving. And if you look over here on the GPS, you can see that my desired track to get to the NDB, I did put Coweta County NDB in there, is 253, and the track that my aircraft is actually doing is 253. So it's just a matter of finding a heading, if you're using raw data, that makes the needle stop moving, and then turning to correct to whatever you want to track. If you're tracking direct, it really doesn't matter what the needle is on. You just want to keep that needle still. If you don't do that, if you just put the needle on the top of the HSI or the card, then you're going to be homing. You're going to fly towards the station. The wind's going to push you off course. The needle will deviate right. You'll correct, and you'll end up flying basically a curved path to the station. So that's how you want to track if you have a crosswind. Again, after about 10 minutes of flying from Hampton, you should be able to see the Coweta County Airport, and you're welcome to make a landing here. If you want to land here, crossing over the NDB at about 2,400 feet will put you in a good position to land on runway 33. The NDB is actually co-located with the outer marker of the instrument landing system for this runway. Once on the ground, we'll taxi back to runway 33 for our next takeoff and set up for the next leg. If you want, you're welcome to skip the landing and just pass over the NDB for the next leg. So if you did choose to make a stop here at Coweta County like I did, I'm going to set up a few things on the ground before we get going to intercept and track some bearings. So the first thing I'm going to do, I still have Coweta County NDB in here, but I've also dialed up Carrollton NDB in the standby frequency, so that is ready to go. I've also put my EFIS CDI over to VOR2 because it's hollow and it's easy to see through, and I've put the tail on 270 so that I can easily have a reference for tracking that 270 degree bearing outbound. With all that set, also I'm going to go over to Carrollton at 4,500 feet, so I've got that in the altitude pre-select there. With all that set up, I think we're ready to take off. And then we'll take off and intercept that bearing out to the 270 bearing outbound, and then track the 360 bearing inbound to Carrollton. For this leg, perform a normal takeoff from runway 33 at Coweta County. Once you reach a safe altitude, turn to a heading of 270 to set up for intercepting our bearing from the Coweta County NDB. Okay, so I'm airborne out of Coweta County, climbing up through about 2,500 feet and heading west, and I want to turn to intercept the 270 degree bearing from the Coweta County NDB. So if I take a look at my bearing pointer right now, it's saying about a 132 and about a 310 from, so I know I'm northwest of the station. And we know that the tail will rise towards the top, but I won't ever quite get to the bearing that I want to be on this heading, so I need to take a little bit more of a sharper intercept here. So to make this needle rise a little more quickly, I'm going to turn to a heading about 240, and that should make the needle rise a little more quickly, and get us onto that bearing too. So I'll just turn right over to that heading. And as you watch here, you'll see that the needle starts to move just a little bit faster. And then we just wait. If I wanted to, make a more aggressive intercept, I could and move the needle a little faster, but I am fairly close to the station, so I don't want to make it move super fast. And if we take a look at kind of the big picture out here, just to get some positional awareness of what we're doing with this raw data, I'll zoom the map out here. There's the Coweta County VOR here, 270 degree bearing is right about there. So as we can see, we are on about a 30 degree intercept to catch that bearing. And then once we catch that, we'll track it outbound for just a little ways. It's only about a 20-mile segment before we would want to turn to Carrollton to intercept that bearing inbound. This will give us a chance to practice tracking outbound on a specific bearing here in just a second. You can see we're only about 10 degrees away from the bearing right now, so we'll want to turn to track that bearing here in just a little bit. Now we're getting pretty close. We know that as soon as these two needles line up here, again, we use the VOR just kind of as a reference. So I'm not actually receiving a VOR on VOR2. It's just to show me when I'm on my course, just as a reference there. So as soon as those two needles are pretty well synced up, then we know that we're on the bearing that we want to track. And we can turn to the 270 heading and intercept just a little bit outside there. So it looks like it's about lined up now. So I'll go ahead and turn to that 270 bearing. And we are tracking that NDB bearing just like we would track a VOR radial now. And again, you can do this also with a VOR radial using NDB pointers. Use the exact same technique to track a VOR radial inbound or outbound. And to take a look at what the same sort of intercept will look like in a old-fashioned NDB. So we've taken off from Coweta County, climbing up through about 2,000 feet, and we are on a 270 heading, and the NDB is off our left wing behind us there a little bit. If we take a look and mentally transpose this needle off over to the heading indicator, it's about 40 degrees. The tail, the bearing from, is about 40 degrees off the nose, so we're on about the 310 relative bearing from the station, just like we were with the last exercise. So again, we need to turn left to intercept, put it at about a 240 heading, and then we want that nose, or that bearing, the bearing pointer tail to rise to where the west is on our heading indicator. So that's about 30 degrees to the right. So we want the tail of that needle to rise to about the 030 relative bearing from. And then at that point, we are on course and we can track outbound on that bearing from. And we see the bearing pointer, the tail of the bearing pointer has fallen to about 30 degrees of relative bearing off the right here. So we should turn to a heading of 270. And then that tail should come straight to the top of the gauge. And then that indicates that we are tracking on the 270 bearing from. So the same procedures, it just looks a little bit different on the old-fashioned gauge. Let's take a look at what we do if we get off course of tracking that bearing. If it deviates off for some reason, maybe you don't have wind correction in or something like that, or you had to turn to avoid traffic, something of that nature. We've gotten off course for whatever reason. Now we're on the 260 degree bearing from. Again, we know that the tail is going to rise and the head is going to fall. So on this heading, we are actually kind of on an intercept heading, but it's not going to rise very fast and it's not going to get there. We're not going to get completely on it on this heading. So again, probably about a 30 degree intercept is a good idea. We'll turn away from it because we want it to keep rising. And if we turn the other way, it's going to rise the wrong way. It's going to rise away from the bearing that we want. So put in about a 30 degree heading, or a 30 degree turn to the right to intercept. And when we do that, we can see that the needle starts to move. It's going to move a little slower because we're getting a little further away from the station, but that'll correct us and get us back on a course. So just turn so the needle will rise back towards the bearing that you want to track outbound, and that should get you back on course. All right, so we've flown a ways away from Coweta VOR now, so I'm going to go ahead and flip over to the Carrollton VOR. And we've got the NDB pointer up there, so we know we're receiving it. I'll go ahead and turn that screen off there. I want to intercept and track the 360 bearing to the station. So we can see we're currently on about the 350 bearing to, or the 170 from. So we're about 10 degrees away, and we get to about a 5 degree point or so. Since we're on a steep 90 degree intercept here, we'll go ahead and turn, and we can start tracking that NDB bearing inbound. And again, remember the tail is going to fall, so it's falling towards the bearing that we want to track inbound. So we'll just keep at this heading, and we could do a little shallower intercept if we wanted. We could turn up to about 300 or even 330 degrees and still get on that bearing, but we'll just leave it on the 90 degree intercept since we're fairly far away from the station. Watch that bearing pointer fall, and then once it's pretty close to north, we'll go ahead and turn north and track the 360 bearing 2. All right, so we're within about 5 degrees or so. It's going to take us a while to turn over here, so we'll go ahead and turn over to a heading of north. And then once we're established on that 360 bearing, we'll just track that all the way up to the NDB. That'll set us up for a nice approach up there into Carrollton. And I actually probably rolled out a little early on that. So probably what I want to do is turn back to the left just a little bit, maybe 10 degrees or so. Put it on like a 320 heading. Excuse me, that would be about a 340 heading there. And again, put that bearing pointer in a position so that it's going to fall the rest of the way to the 360 bearing 2. And I can also change my course here and line that up as a reference point again, like I did with that 270 degree bearing outbound. I want to line this up so that it's on the 0 or the 360 there, and then once those two needle heads line up, I know I'm on course. Again, all this VOR the VOR needle here is a reference for us. Now we can see the needle there is right in the middle of our VOR needle, our little reference point there. So I'll go ahead and turn and track that 360 bearing inbound to Carrollton. And that will set us up nicely for a landing on runway 35 up there at Carrollton, if you'd like to do that. And looking at our kind of big picture on the moving map here, you can see here's Coweta County NDB over here. We tracked that outbound and then switched over to Carrollton and then intercepted and tracked the 360 bearing to Carrollton there. So that's kind of the big picture of what you're doing when you're doing that with raw data. And the same thing holds true for tracking a bearing 2. Again, I just plucked the needle off of this gauge and mentally put it over here on my heading indicator. So right now it's about 20 degrees back or in front of my left wing. So it's a relative bearing to the station of about a 340. And again, the head's going to fall. So once it lines up with the east or the 090 there, I know that's the 360 degree bearing 2. And once it's there, I can go ahead and turn and track to the station. So again, same procedure. It's just we require a little bit of mental imagination here to move that needle over here to figure out what our magnetic bearing is. One last thing to look at here is what station passage looks like when you pass over an NDB. Just like a VOR, as you get closer to the station, the needle is going to be more and more sensitive, and just like with a VOR, you don't want to chase the needle when you get close to the station and it gets that sensitive. Just try to make small corrections to keep it more or less on course. And as you'll see here in just a few seconds, when you pass the station, all that happens is the needle swings around the tail. The head swings to where the tail was. It just makes a 180 degree turn. And that indicates that you passed over the station with an NDB, or again, that would happen with a VOR if you're using a bearing pointer system to navigate with a VOR. And you can see the needle starting to drift off to the side there. Again, I'm not going to go try to chase it because I know it's pretty well on course. You can make small corrections if you want to try to stay pretty close to your bearing, but you can see it's swinging pretty quickly right now, so that indicates that looks like we're passing over the station. It's coming through 60, 90 degrees pretty quickly there, so we were pretty close to passing right over the top of the NDB, and it's falling back behind us, so we have station passage. That's what station passage looks like on an NDB. As you get close to the NDB at Carrollton, it should be pretty easy to pick up the field and make a straight into runway 35. Like Coweta County, the NDB is co-located with the outer marker for the ILS to this runway, and crossing the NDB at about 2,400 feet will set you up well for a landing on this runway if you wish to attempt one. That concludes this lesson on NDBs and bearing pointers. Hopefully it's giving you the skills you need to use these old navaids and apply those skills with more modern EFIS avionics. If you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.